my Belgian friends picked us up in Milan.
I think of you talking about the...
Taylor community resident Jim Brewer began his storytelling career in 1985 at the Bosquani Inn on Newfound Lake, while still a distinguished English teacher at Holderness School and Phillips Exeter Academy. After Jim retired from teaching, he became increasingly well known as a storyteller, performing at area schools and campgrounds, heading up the U.S. Forest Service's Woods in Winter storytelling program, and leading a group for Dartmouth's Institute for Lifelong Education. His most impressive credential is his 18 years of appearances at the Corner House Inn storytelling programs in Sandwich. I'm honored to have Jim here for his final outing. Please join me in welcoming Jim Brewer.
Well, it's wonderful to have you all here. And I see many, many familiar faces and a few who date from way back when we did our first storytelling 6 years ago. This is the final outing. In other words, people said, "Are you going to stop telling stories?" No, a storyteller doesn't stop telling stories. But stop telling them in clumps. This is a clump tonight, and we won't do any more clumps. And I'm very pleased to have you all along because it's always seemed like a mutual journey to me. Most of you are from the radio generation, which was a great experience when you think about it, because all you had was words and you did all the imagining and provided all the colors and the characters and so on and so forth. And that makes you a super audience, because that's all I can provide is words, and the rest is up to you. So we're taking this journey together. And the first thing that was on the docket was a couple of telephone calls. And why would I, having received as many as you have, telephone calls over these many years, dredge up these two? Well, I think you'll understand. My career arc was I started at Holderness, and then I was headmaster of the Barlow School in New York for a while, and then I went to Exeter, and then I came back to Holderness. And so some of these stories use those locations. The first one happened at Barlow, and I had been there, it was my second or third year. Things were peaceful and settled, and I was sitting in my office one morning, and I got a call from one of the mothers, one of our students, who was a favorite person and somebody who had been a supporter and helped out a lot with the school. And she called me up, and after a moment of chit-chat, she said, "Jim, is Polly using an intrauterine protective device?" All I could think of was things that were completely inappropriate to say. You know, it was way out of the yes/no category. When I finally arrived at, "You've talked this over with Polly, have you?" And she wasn't forthcoming. And she said, "Well, actually, no, I haven't." And I said, "You expect me to?" And she admitted that was kind of a long shot. The headmasters are supposed to be somewhat, what's my word I want? All-knowing. And not quite. The other one occurred at Exeter. And after the rather tumultuous years at Barlow, going to Exeter as a teacher and coach was a very pleasant experience. And I had been there 2 years, and my phone rang one night when I was correcting papers, and the voice said, male voice, said, "Is this the Jim Brewer?" And I said, "No, that isn't the way I've ever thought of myself or anybody's ever spoken of me before." He said, "Well, Jim," he said, "I got to tell you this. You've got a beautiful body." Well, we went, we went back, that was a little hard to get started on too. We went back and forth. I thought maybe it was a fellow faculty member, but it wasn't. And it developed, that was a time when the lockers down at Hampton Beach were the scene of a lot of homosexual activity. And apparently there was a bulletin board. And on the bulletin board was a picture of Jim Brewer. I guess was quite an imposing fellow. And he hadn't provided his telephone number, which would have been a decent thing to do under the circumstances. So this person who called me had gone to the phone book, and there I was. Well, we got that all straightened out, and he hung up, and I had to do something with it, so I called a family meeting, and my children were all in the house, and got my wife in the living room, and I said, I've just had a telephone call from a man who said, "You have a beautiful body." And the resultant hysteria wasn't very flattering. While I was at Holderness during my first term there, got moved to an apartment that is part of the main building. If you drive by that campus at the back, there's a very handsome, large brick building, and we moved into an apartment that was on the left side of it. And it had a covered porch entry that was more an architectural feature than any porch a human being could use. And it was all brick, and it was only about 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. But it did keep the snow out of the front door, so it was useful. One fall morning, I walked out the door, and to my right, I became aware of a shape that was a dog that was all curled up in the corner, the bricks. And I went over to him, and I spoke to him, and a great big head emerged, and gray in the muzzle and scars, and his ears were chipped. And I encouraged him to come on in, and he got up rather stiffly, and he was just under mastiff size. And he came around and came in the front door, and it was that time of the morning when the children were getting all set for school, and our 2 dogs were there in the excitement, and in comes this monstrous animal. The children were delighted, and were all over him immediately. We were patting him, and the 2 dogs recognized our 2 dogs at the time were a young black Labrador and a Bassoodle. And that's she happened to be a Basset body with poodle hair and poodle head and poodle intelligence. And they immediately recognized that this was Alpha who had come in the door. And there was a good deal of stirring about, and the children said, "Go keep him." And no, he has an owner, we have to take care of that. And so I went off to work, the children went off to school, and I left my wife Joan dealing with the question of whose dog this was and how we were going to get him back to whoever owned him. And when I came home after work, Joan said that the owner, she had indeed found the owner. Somebody had reported the dog had run away, and that the owner had come, and that she did not like the owner at all. She did not like the way he handled the dog, and did not like the way the dog had responded to him, but it was his dog, and off he went. And I didn't feel good about that. She didn't feel good about that the dog had come through the whole Holderness campus to our porch for whatever reason. And we felt we'd let him down to some extent. So that was over. 2 days later, I walk out the door, curled up on the corner, a great big dog. And at that point, we knew his name, very excitingly, was Ted. So I said, Ted, come on in, and he knew the drill, and he came right in, and everybody was excited to see him again. And I said, he's come from wherever he's come twice to us. We're not going to send him off again. And so I said, yeah, we're going to keep him. And I called up, we had the owner's number, and I called him up, and I was prepared to buy the dog or do whatever I had to get him. And I said, hello, Ted is at our place again. And the owner said, blank, dog. He said, I don't want him, you keep him if you want to. Crash. That was the conversation. Thus we became owners of Ted, who adjusted very swiftly to having full meals, a day full of patting, and a comfortable bed. Almost anything seemed a comfortable bed to him. And I have two Ted stories. He was, of course, the warrior. And although he didn't seem to have much experience with little people, my 3 little people became his charges. And the next spring, I think I was probably going off to lacrosse practice. And there was a gaggle of children out front. And a boarding school is a pretty good place for children and dogs for slightly different reasons. The children seemed to arrive in sort of echelons on the campus, so that there was always a group of playmates about the same age as my own children, and so that was wonderful. Dogs have it good too, because half the students have dogs at home, and they're more than happy to pat a dog if they see one. So it was a good time for Ted. Anyway, that afternoon I set off for lacrosse practice, gaggle of children playing in the front yard. Ted's there, of course. And from the opposite side of campus, actually up a road off the campus, a couple of those kids were there, and their dog had come with them, and he was a part Malamute, and he was a big boy, and he was supposed to be a fierce fighter. And so there he was, and suddenly, with all these small children around, there was a confrontation with these 2 very large animals snarling at one another and closing. And I didn't want a dog fight to happen with the kids there, so I tossed my crutches and spun around, sat down in a position where I could get hold of their collars. And I thought, oh, I'm going to get bitten. The Malamute didn't know me at all. And I got hold of the collars, and they parted without the slightest effort on my part. And of course kept making fierce noises at each other. And why they didn't fight, I don't know. For people who didn't understand the spectacle, and faculty came running and students came running, why, Brewer had obviously executed a feat of Herculean strength. I had separated these 2 ferocious animals and held them at bay until help came. Well, it was an all-boys school at that point, and that was the kind of story that circulated very well. And it came up in class a few times, and it came up at the dining table a few times, and I was able to be winningly modest and absolutely truthful at the same time, and I would tell him it was nothing. Well, Ted started looking younger than he had at first as he added 10, 15 pounds and had good food, and life was fine, and he was not as old a dog as he looked when he first was struggling off those cold bricks. And he was with us for quite a while. And he was with us at Barlow when I took over the headmastership of that school. And one of the drills that we had to learn was that there was the annual trustees meeting. And the way the Barlow trustees worked, they came in just once a year in the morning. They were a very affable group, and we had good meetings. And by noon, they wanted a drink, and then lunch and coffee, and they were gone. That first year, as we were figuring our way, why I served sherry. And then through our meat dealer got a magnificent, about 8-pound tenderloin of beef. And we had a good recipe for scalloped potatoes. And there was a salad, and Joan, my wife, was a wonderful baker. And then there was apt to be a loaf of bread, which people really didn't need, but usually ate some of. The first year I was informed that really sherry was not the drink the group wanted at noon. And that if I put bourbon and scotch out, it would be a much better choice. So we put out the bourbon and scotch, and it actually happened in the third year that we had the whole routine down. I would go out while the trustees were having their cocktails, and I would carve the tenderloin. And it would be so tender that it was something they could cut on their laps, on the plates in their laps. My wife, Joan, stuck her head in and said, before I got out there, she said, "Jim," and I went out to the kitchen, and lying under the kitchen table was the happiest dog in God's world. He had the 8-pound tenderloin. He didn't have many teeth left, but his jaw strength was terrific, and he was juicing it is the best word I can call, and looking divinely happy about it. I thought I might, it wasn't a moment when we could, thaw hot dogs or something, so I wondered how Ted would take to having the roast removed. And he actually was very good about it. He realized that he had committed a perfectly prodigious no-no by taking something off the counter, and he surrendered it rather meekly. And I held it up sort of like a dead fish. It looked awful. It looked like something an old dog had chewed on the kitchen floor for a while. But it was all we had, so we washed it lovingly. Made sure there was no obvious debris in it. And then it still looked awful. So we concocted a sauce, mayonnaise and horseradish and some didn't have to cook it, thickener and a few other condiments from the refrigerator. And then we used a pastry knife to spread it until this thing was completely coated. And then my wife, let's see, which end did she get on? I carve with my right hand, so she got on the left end, and I had a hand here to hold it together while I carved it. So the separation in the meat was slight. And it looked a little strange, but we put it on the table. And the trustees, fresh from cocktails, helped themselves. And first, there were exclamations of happiness about how good the sauce was. I had thought of it as a coating, but they saw it as sauce. And then they commented on the tenderness of the beef. And Joan and I couldn't look at each other. And we made it through the rest of the meal, and they went happily on their way. And I went out in the kitchen afterwards, and the tenderizer was asleep under the table. Well, we had a few more years of Ted. The fact that he came to us, selected us, always seemed sort of an honor, and he was a treat. A lot of you know I'm interested in butterflies. And you know probably that butterflies have short life cycles normally, and that they occur in different times through the late spring and summer. And that they emerged fully mature, and one of the first things they do is breed. And then the female lays her eggs in June or July. And the eggs have to make it to the following June or July, about 11 months probably. And there are all kinds of hazards along the way in terms of weather and birds and all kinds of things that would devour or wash off butterfly eggs. But a few butterflies return in the cycle each year. Right now we have, what are they? American tiger swallowtails, big yellow butterflies in numbers around the campus. But their time will go by and other butterflies will take their place. I want to tell you about a particular butterfly and how I came to see it and know it. Now, I can't remember, it was 4 or 5 years ago that we had the February thaw. Remember when the temperature suddenly went up to 80? Many things that we didn't want to have break ground broke ground because they thought it was spring. And we had some abnormally warm February days. And I was walking Pogo, my little dog of the time, in my shirt sleeves because it was over 80 degrees. And we were around behind Woodside on this side. And the lawn area was increasing almost as you watched, and you could hear the snow melting as it collapsed on itself. And in that 12, 14-foot lawn area, there was a butterfly. And it was absolutely flat, and it was a very strange color. Butterfly colors are kind of microdots, and they wear off in time. And this fellow's microdots had all worn off, and maybe you had a relative who had a horsehair sofa, and you remember what the spot looked like where the horsehair had worn off, and you could see the horse skin underneath, and it was sort of a grayish, yuckish color. And that was the color of the butterfly, and it was absolutely immobile. And I mean, I looked at it, and it had just the ghost of a pattern along the back wing. And I went home and looked it up, and it was a mourning cloak. And a mourning cloak in its time is a beautiful sable to black butterfly with a white fringe on the back of its wings and purple and blue triangles in decoration that you can see if you ever have one close up. Second time, the next year at Easter, we were walking up, coming up toward Woodside, and in the woods, I thought I was looking at an oak leaf that was fluttering down. You know how oak leaves come down late, except this fluttered and then it fluttered up, and it was making horizontal progress. And it was a flying butterfly. And I realized from the color and what I'd found out about the mourning cloak that it was a mourning cloak. In those barren woods, not a flower in sight. And then finally I saw one in the woods briefly, just a flash of one, when he was his handsome sable self. And then a year later, in October, I found one sitting opposite the garages up here. And he had lost his dramatic colors. He was brown and black, and he was a little smaller than a monarch, but he was chunkier. So and I guess I've had one sighting since. So, okay, how does this all work? That the butterfly is born in the spring, different dates, and you'll see why. And he makes his way through the summer as that handsome sable creature. And then comes a time when there's nothing for a butterfly to eat. The brown and black one I saw out here was just waiting. And what was he waiting for? It's some kind of a clue in the temperature that sends him up, I think, into the ceiling of the garages. Now, an odd note in a butterfly book, but the mourning cloaks really like concrete. Heaven knows what they did before concrete, but at any rate, they like concrete. And so he flies up into the concrete and finds a place where he's going to spend the winter. And at that point, because he would freeze solid, he converts. All his bodily fluids become the equivalent of glycol. And his bodily functions slow down and down and down until there's almost nothing happening. And he spends the winter that way. But then the moment comes in the spring, and again, it must be triggered by a temperature change. And the butterfly has to get into the sun. I think that was that ghost butterfly I saw on the lawn had somehow made it. I don't know how he'd made it. I don't know what energy he'd had to make it. By that time, he hadn't eaten in 5 or 6 months. But he made it out to the lawn. And then I think he had to sit in the sunshine, and the warmth of the sun helped him convert his glycol back to his natural body fluids. Then he took off with his flight muscles deteriorated after long non-use, and that was the thing I saw flapping through the woods. And it's an erratic flight, it's an awkward flight, and it's a tremendously motivated flight because he has a purpose. He is going to find another equally dilapidated ancient female mourning cloak, and they are going to mate. Absolutely at the end of their life cycle. And I expect he dies, and she does one more thing. She lays her eggs. And I thought, why this stupendous, difficult fasting and freezing and completely different life pattern? And then I realized it was very simple. I just said it. She lays her eggs. And her eggs are out there for 5 weeks, 6 weeks, instead of 11 months. And the whole life cycle is devoted to giving those eggs a very short time when they're vulnerable, and we get more mourning cloaks. Now, they're listed as occasional butterflies. You only see them once in a rare while, and I'm looking for them. And I go back to that flight, that difficult flight through the woods, and reminds me a little of Don Quixote, going out through all kinds of adversity. And the amazing thing is they succeed. That in the back of the butterfly book is the ranges for various butterflies. And some have just a little swatch in New England, and others different parts of the country. And you open it up to the mourning cloak, and mourning cloaks are successful all the way across the country, down into Mexico, up into Alaska, adapting their already totally peculiar lifestyle to the obviously different circumstances. In other words, one wonders if a Florida mourning cloak can produce glycol. Probably not a question that keeps scientists tossing and turning. And I guess the image I carry away is that flight, that wonderful flight where at the absolute end of their lives, they muster the energy to make sure that that next generation is going to keep going. All right, well, this is Brookline Man. And some of you remember when I talked about the farm in Vermont that my family owned. And we bought it in 1948. And it was a 1750s farmhouse. And in the days we bought it, why, it was on a reassuring rise above the road, and then there was a road, and then there was a steep bank, and then there was Grassy Brook down here. And somehow in the discussions we had with the realtor, he never mentioned that Grassy Brook could turn into a roaring monster. And the farm, in the way of old farmhouses, had a dug basement. And that when Grassy Brook turned into a roaring monster, the water percolated under the road into the basement, which accounted for the reason that the furnace that was there looked so dangerous. So early on, about 1950, why our contractor said he could extend the basement, enlarge the basement, and put in a concrete basement that would be waterproof. And this was all done with hand labor, because as far as I could see, the old stone foundations weren't disturbed as they did this. But at any rate, we ended up with the waterproof basement. Somewhere in the course of digging under that, we don't know at what depth, but one of the workmen encountered this fellow. And he knew he was something unusual, but he did something inexplicable with him. My mother had a perennial garden that I could see from the window of my bedroom. And he dug a little hole in just as a corner piece in her garden, and he plonked the piece in upside down. Which was sort of strange. Obviously he'd recognized that it was something unusual, and we'll never know why he put it in upside down. So for a couple of years, I would see this red post when I got up in the morning, and then one summer day in 1952, it had rained very hard, and I thought, I'm looking at something more. And I went out and I plucked this fellow out of the ground. And I carried him around with me for years, and people who met him had various opinions about what he was made out of, where he had come from. And eventually, about a decade ago, things don't happen very quickly in his life. About a decade ago, my nephew, who works at the Guggenheim Museum, was visiting, and we got talking about Brookline Man, and he got intrigued, and he said, "Do you mind if I take him for a while?" And I said, "Not at all." And he said, I'll have our antiquities people look at him." So it took about 5 years for him to have this part of his life. The antiquities people at the museum looked at him and said, "We don't know what he is." He went from there very deliberately over to the Metropolitan Museum, where their antiquities people examined him very closely, hoping that they would find something of the original decoration that he may have had, some tiny bit of paint. They didn't find anything. And what they would have done if they'd found some little indicator like that would be try to carbon date him, because then at least we'd know what era he came from. But didn't find anything, and finally had to say, "We don't know what he is." And so he went to the Smithsonian in his very deliberate way. And the Smithsonian folks have a sort of forensic archaeologist, and he came up with the fact that he is a tufa. Yeah, that was my reaction to a tufa. Well, that clears it all up for us. It turns out it's a kind of rock. This was ancient tufa, by the way. that happens when you might, let's say a stream is running over a rocky base and it's picking up minerals as it goes, and it falls into a little pond that has other minerals, and gradually over the years the combination of the minerals will yield this rather porous rock. And I went online to learn a little more about it and discovered that it's quite common. You can buy a lump of tufa, which is gray-white, and don't know what you do with it, but you can buy it for $4 or $5. And that really didn't help us. But the other thing he said is that it either came, this particular ancient tufa material, either came from Central America, which is not very precise, or the Ossipee region of New Hampshire, which, you know, sort of surged forward, oh good. But nothing more than that. And the art form does have a particular look to it, and it may have reminded some of you of something, usually seen in a much larger form. And thank you, yes, please take a look at him. If he has any characteristics at all, it's of a Easter Island head. The square ears particularly are Easter Island. And so in looking around for something that looks like him, why, the Easter Island monoliths look like him, and that's not a big help either. And finally, the Metropolitan, I mean, where are we? We're down at the Smithsonian. And they said, we don't know what he is. And so my nephew, who's a fine artist, said, and I talked it over and said, well, let's not just have him lying around anymore. And so he made a cherry wood base for him, and he's sitting on a deerskin, and he has a substantial bolt that runs up his middle so that he will sort of be safe there on his standard. So we don't know what he is. And you know, the Metropolitan, the Guggenheim, and the Smithsonian agree that they don't know what he is. And museums are always looking for things for their collections, but he doesn't fit in any collections, so nobody wanted him. So where does he go from here? I think, since my children are not exactly lusting to have him, is that fair, daughter? Why, some of you may remember from that time I talked about the farm, that down the road from the farm was the Little Round Schoolhouse. And the Little Round Schoolhouse had a story that I dismissed for 50 years. I did really well on this. And they said that the Little Round Schoolhouse had been built by a famous English highwayman by the name, he was Thunderbolt, his partner was Lightning, and the Thunderbolt had changed his name, come to the valley, had the house built round, and then the end of the story was that he'd been a fine school teacher and he'd had the house built round so he couldn't get cornered. And that was, it seemed like a Vermont story to me, and I dismissed it. Actually, it's true. In 1822, the little town of Brookline had had a total disaster, an enormous flood, and Brookline had been much more of a town than it ever was afterwards. It had a sawmill and an inn and a general store, and all sorts of buildings. And the flood erased them, and one of the problems they had was that they not only did not have a schoolhouse, but they did not have a teacher. Whether he was swept away in the flood or just decided to leave, we don't know. But at any rate, there was a vacancy. And very conveniently, in 1822, Mr. John Wilson, highly articulate Scot actually, presented himself and said that he would take the teaching job if they would build a building. And so they built the building. And the round schoolhouse is there, and it turns out that the building is unique. at least on our East Coast, and that where you find it, exact same thing, is in northern Scotland, where they're used for storage barns, and they used, historically, the same building was used as a keep, where they might hold prisoners. And if we follow John Wilson's story, why he taught for a while in Brookline, he moved to Newfane, which is the county seat, all of 3 miles south of Brookline, and then he moved to Brattleboro, which is sort of the nearby big city in that area. And in one setting, and I still don't have them straight, in one setting he was a lawyer with a very successful practice. And in the other setting, he was a doctor, also with a successful practice. And it turns out, as people have tracked his story, that he was indeed a Scot who went to medical school. And how things fell off and he became a highwayman, we don't know. But when John Wilson finally died in 1853 in Brattleboro, he had left what he thought were controlling instructions about the fact he wanted to be buried in the clothes that he died in. And the mortician apparently wasn't clued into this fact, and in the normal course of events, stripped him. And around his neck, which he'd always kept covered with high collar, were scars that indicated that he'd once had a metal band around his neck, which was the way that convicts were laced together. It would have had an eye in it, chain would have gone through the eye. And he had, his right heel was just missing. And he had a terrible gunshot wound in his right leg. And this actually started with, along with a few things in his belongings that seemed peculiar for, that perhaps dated back to his days on the highway. And so they built his whole history sort of backwards. And today, what about Lightning? Lightning came over with him, and one judge said Lightning was not the brains of the operation, and he was hung in Cambridge in 1823 for committing some kind of not terribly bright robbery. Today there are artifacts of John Wilson that can be found in the Brattleboro Museum and in the Newfane Museum, where there's actually a portrait of him. And the Round Schoolhouse has become a museum. And of course, it's the principal John Wilson artifact in itself, because the system of roof supports is unique to those brown Scottish barns and keeps. But as you string things together, and history hasn't done it, but one wonders if John Wilson, during the period that he was a convict, might have spent some time in one of those keeps and had very little to occupy his very active mind except how the thing was put together, because his building that was built in Brookline was an exact replica. And my hope is that since they have photos and history of Brookline, that the museum might be happy to take this fellow having to admit that nobody has any idea what he is, but he's only about 3/4 of a mile where he first saw daylight in 1950. Before that, who knows? My friend Dave Stamps, who's doing the photography here tonight, was telling me that there was a series on Nova about ancient civilizations, and that those programs were turning up ancient art forms that were things that people had not seen before. So maybe a moment lurks in the future when somebody goes, oh, and we know who this guy is. Last thing, short little story. You'll know where it's going right from the first, but it's okay. They had, at a Kentucky breeding facility, horse breeding facility. They had two tragedies close to each other. A mother gave birth to a dead foal, and afterwards was terribly anxious about where her foal was. And a little while later, the reverse happened. A mother died delivering a live foal. And as you probably know, why the foals have to have, the mother's milk contains colostrum and all the things that the animal is supposed to have to protect it during its first days. And so sometimes a mare will reject a strange foal, but they led the mare up to where the foal was, and she'd been whickering, nickering, asking, calling. And when she had a response from this knock-kneed little fella, why, she went right to him. And her attitude was, wow, I've been looking for you everywhere, and here you are. And I expect the colt's attitude could be summed up in, Mom. Little story. And kind of story you search for these days that's positive, a nice working out of things. And we are at the end. I'm glad you have joined me for this journey. You have, as always, been wonderful audience, which is always a treat for the storyteller. And so thank you very much, and good night.
Tonight. It's a very special event. Touting this as your final outing, I didn't want today to go by because I feel like it's a big deal. And you're a big deal, and we wanted to make a big deal of this. So we hosted this little wine reception, and we have a special gift for you.
Oh my goodness.
So the special gift, I'll take it out of the box, is an engraved plaque with the Taylor logo on it, and it says, in recognition of James E. Brewer II, our Taylor Community star performer at his final outing on June 25th, 2018.
Thank you very much. That is fantastic. That's very special. Thank you so much. And really, after telling the stories, I don't have a lot more to say.
No need. Put it in there for you. Thank you so much.